Baek Sai-hyun did not come home alone. He walked through the front door of his own mansion, with one hand resting on the lower back of a woman who was not his wife, and she was visibly, undeniably pregnant. He guided her across the threshold, the way a man guides someone he has already decided belongs there. No hesitation, no apology written in his posture. Just entitlement, quiet and enormous, filling every corner of the room before he even looked up. And when he finally looked up, he saw his entire life displayed across the walls. Every photograph, every hotel, every lie. His wife had been gone for 6 hours. She had spent those 6 hours making sure he would never be able to say he didn't know exactly what he had done. Sounding. If you have ever loved someone who slowly taught you to make yourself smaller, subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels, because this one is going to stay with you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, slipped beneath the front door of the Hamdong mansion sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the security rotation changed, and then guards posted at the south corridor took his coffee break. 14 minutes longer than he was supposed to. Imani Delacroix Beck found it when she came downstairs at 6:15, still in the oversized cotton shirt she slept in when Sai-hyun was traveling, which was most nights now. She almost stepped over it. Her mind was already running the morning's checklist, the restoration appointment at the gallery, the call with her supplier in Amsterdam, the medication she kept forgetting to take after the second miscarriage because taking it meant that there wasn't a pregnancy to support anymore. Then she saw her name on the front of the envelope. Not printed, handwritten. In Korean characters she could read perfectly after 8 years, but would never write with the same confidence. No return address, no stamp. She stood in the foyer in bare feet on cold marble for a long moment before she picked it up. Inside was a single photograph. Sai-hyun stood inside what she recognized as the private elevator of the Dongbuk Grand. She knew that elevator because they had stayed there twice for their 3rd anniversary, and once when the mansion's heating system failed in January. His back was partially turned to the camera. His arm was wrapped around a woman Imani had never seen. The woman was younger, Korean, dressed in the kind of effortless, expensive simplicity that takes considerable effort. She had her face tilted up toward Sai-hyun's, and he was kissing her in that unhurried, comfortable way that doesn't belong to new passion. His left hand was visible against the woman's cheek. His wedding ring caught the elevator light. Imani set the photograph on the kitchen counter. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the city below. The hill began moving delivery trucks. A woman walking a small dog, the first commuters crossing the pedestrian bridge. She drank the coffee. Then she went back to the photograph and looked at it for a long time, the way she's looked at damaged paintings, before she decided what they needed. She did not cry. That surprised her. What she felt instead was something colder and more specific than grief, the sensation of a puzzle piece clicking into place, completing a picture she hadn't understood she was already looking at. The 3 weeks Sai-hyun had spent in Busan, managing the logistics contracts. The conference in Tokyo where he had stopped texting her goodnight after the second day. The way his phone now lived face down on every surface. The way he had stopped touching her after the second miscarriage, not gradually, the way grief separates people. Abruptly, like a door closing. She had told herself he was struggling too. She had given him the benefit of so much doubt that she'd nearly disappeared inside it. She put the photograph in the bottom drawer of her studio desk, beneath the restoration invoices and supply catalogs, and she went to work. The second photograph arrived 4 days later. This one showed Sai-hyun, and the same woman at a restaurant Imani knew a private room kaiseki place in Apgujeong that Sai-hyun called too formal whenever Imani suggested it for their anniversary. The woman was laughing at something. Sai-hyun was watching her laugh with an expression Imani recognized. She had spent years trying to earn that expression. It was the one where his whole face loosened, and he forgot briefly to manage himself. He had never looked that way at a kaiseki dinner with Imani. He had never looked that way at much of anything Imani did after the first miscarriage. The third photograph came 8 days after that, the fourth 5 days later. By the time the seventh arrived, Imani had stopped being surprised. She had started a folder on the external hard drive she kept locked in her studio safe, the one Sion didn't know the combination to, because she had changed it after the second miscarriage, quietly, without explanation, out of some protective instinct she couldn't have named at the time. She didn't know who was sending them. Someone inside his organization, maybe. Someone with a conscience or a grudge. She didn't contact them. She didn't need to. The photographs were already telling her everything. She needed to know the rest herself. Kwon Jae-wook came recommended through 3 intermediaries, specifically because he had no connection to Seoul's legal or criminal networks that Sae-hyun's people might recognize. He was a former financial crimes investigator who now worked private cases with the kind of meticulous, unhurried competence that made him expensive and completely necessary. When Imani sat across from him in the back room of a tea house in Mapo, she spread 6 of the photographs across the table without preamble. Jae-wook studied each one for exactly as long as it needed. He didn't offer sympathy. She hadn't asked for it. "You want the financial picture," he said. "Everything," Imani said. "The money, where it moves, how it's categorized, who else knows?" Quoted her a figure. She paid half in advance from an account. Saihan had no access to the private savings she had built from her own restoration work, quietly, methodically, over 4 years. She had started the account without any particular plan. She understood now that some part of her had always understood she might need it. Celeste Monroe Han, she found through a different channel a contact from her graduate school years in Prantam International Family Law in Seoul. Celeste was Korean-American, 43, fluent in 3 languages, and completely free of sentiment. Their first conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end, Celeste had outlined 4 possible legal strategies, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had watched enough power marriages dissolve to know exactly where the hidden injuries were. "He controls the narrative inside his organization and his family," Celeste said. "That's the first thing we have to neutralize." How? By making the evidence more powerful than the narrative. Imani understood that instinctively. She was a conservator. She spent her professional life making truth visible through accumulated, patient, careful evidence, removing layers of obscuring damage until the original surface emerged. She knew exactly how that worked. Jae-wook took 6 weeks. What he brought back was worse than the photographs. The woman in the photographs was Yoon Hae-rin, 29 years old, an image consultant whose firm handled public relations for 3 companies directly tied to Baekjin Holdings' legitimate operations. The affair had been running for 18 months. Sae-hyun had set up a housing account under a Baekjin subsidiary that covered Hae-rin's apartment in Yongsan, a full floor of a building the subsidiary technically managed. He had routed vacation expenses through corporate entertainment budgets. Jewelry had been categorized as client appreciation gifts. The money trail was elegant, exactly the way Sihan's strategies always were. Difficult to see if you weren't looking specifically for it. Impossible to deny once you found it. Then Jae-wook set a final document on the table and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "She's pregnant," he said. 4 months, he knows. His mother knows. They've already had the family conversation. Imani sat very still. "His mother," she said. "Yes." "Myung-ja." "Yes." She asked him the question she already knew the answer to. "For how long?" "From what I can document, Myung-ja has been aware for approximately 2 months. There are communications between them. The plan appears to be Jae-wook chose his words with care that you accept the Copenhagen Fellowship you were offered. The marriage dissolves quietly. Cultural incompatibility is the reason given. In 6 months, Hae-rin's pregnancy is presented to the family circle as a new beginning. Imani heard that without flinching. She had been offered the Copenhagen Fellowship 3 months ago. A prestigious museum restoration project, 12 months of work she had genuinely wanted. She had hesitated about accepting it because she was afraid Sae-hyun would interpret it as abandonment during a fragile time in their marriage. She understood now why Sae-hyun had recently started encouraging her to take it. "What's the rest?" she said. Jae-wook slid a printed email across the table. It was a message from Hae-rin to Myung-ja, dated 6 weeks ago. Most of it was logistics, nursery timing, family announcement sequencing, Hae-rin's preference for certain seasonal details in the press release, Myungja's team would quietly float. Near the end of the message, in a casual paragraph that clearly assumed Imani was already an abstraction already gone, already reduced to practical considerations, Hae-rin had written about the 2 small watercolors Imani kept in the room she used as a studio inside the mansion. The paintings were simple, abstract, muted, the only 2 pieces of her own work Imani had completed since the miscarriages, each one painted in the weeks afterward when she had needed somewhere to put feeling that had no other container. Hae-rin suggested removing those sad paintings before the house was redecorated. She wrote that they made the room feel heavy, and she wanted the space to finally feel alive. Imani read the email once. She folded it in half. She put it in her bag. "I'll need everything digitally duplicated and stored in 3 separate locations," she said. "One with Celeste's firm. One with my personal attorney in New York. One with someone I trust outside both. I can arrange that," Jae-wook said. "One more thing," she paused. "The nursery inside the mansion. Do you know which room?" he told her. Imani was quiet for a moment. "That was my room," she said finally. "I chose those walls myself." Jae-wook said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She told Sae-hyun about Copenhagen at dinner. She watched his face carefully as she spoke the way she now watched every conversation, reading what moved beneath his expressions like a restorer studying the underpaint beneath a surface damaged by smoke. He paused with his chopsticks resting across his bowl. "You should go," he said. "It's a rare opportunity. You've given too much up for Seoul." The kindness in his voice was genuine enough that it turned her stomach. "I'll need to start organizing my things," she said. "Of course." He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "Don't rush. Take what you need." She looked at his hand on hers. She thought about the nursery walls she had chosen. The watercolors she had painted in the weeks when the grief had been so physical it felt like a second body living inside her own. The email suggesting those paintings be removed so the house could finally feel alive. She thought, "I have been trying not to take up too much space in this house for years. I have been apologizing for my grief. I have been shrinking myself to fit inside a marriage that was already being dismantled around me." She said, "Thank you, Sae-hyun." She removed her hand from beneath his. She went upstairs. And for the first time since the photographs began arriving, she cried not from grief, not from anger, but from some specific and final recognition that the marriage she had believed in had not been destroyed by Hae-rin or by Myungja or by any external force. It had been given away slowly, deliberately, by the man who had promised it to her. She cried for about 20 minutes. Then she stopped. Then she started planning. The purchases were careful and deliberate. A high-quality color printer, archival photo paper, enough adhesive mounting strips to cover 7 rooms without leaving permanent wall damage. She was precise about this. She was not trying to destroy the house, only to transform it temporarily, and only for one audience. She printed everything Jae-wook had documented. She organized it chronologically. She cross-referenced the photographs with the financial transfers, the hotel bookings with the corporate accounts, the restaurant receipts with the entertainment budgets. She thought about how Sae-hyun organized his own evidence when he was building a case against someone who had wronged his organization, how he never confronted before he had everything. How he never moved until the moment he had chosen with precision. She had learned from the best. She worked in the studio at night, after the household staff had left and Sae-hyun was in his study or away. She worked methodically and without music, because she needed her own thoughts clear. She built the installation the way she would build a restoration plan room by room, each space assigned its specific purpose, each photograph chosen for what it would communicate to its specific viewer. The foyer for Sae-hyun, because that was where he experienced the first shock of any situation in the moment of arrival. The staircase for the story, because a staircase forces movement, forces the viewer to travel through the evidence, rather than stand still before it. The dining room, because that was where the Baek family performed its power, where the generations of men hung framed on the walls, and Myungja presided, and Imani had always felt most visibly foreign. Myungja's sitting room, because Myungja needed to understand specifically what she had helped orchestrate. Not the affair, the cruelty inside the small details, the email, the paintings. Sai-hyun's study, because that was where he believed himself most untouchable, surrounded by his own image, his own accomplishments, his own narrative about who he was. And the nursery. The nursery, because she needed to say one thing that she could not say in any other room to anyone who would ever come after her with the audacity to call those walls empty. She set her departure for a Monday. Sai-hyun was scheduled to arrive home Monday evening with several family members for what his assistant had cryptically described in the calendar as a family occasion dinner, which Imani, with what she now knew, understood was the pregnancy announcement. The timing was not accident. She had chosen it the same way Sai-hyun chose his moments for maximum clarity. She woke before 5. She moved through the house in near dark, room by room, mounting each photograph with the steady hands of someone who has spent 20 years making permanent decisions about fragile things. She did not rush. She was precise. In the foyer, Si-hyun and Hae-rin emerging from the Dongbuk Grand, his wedding ring visible in the frame. Up the staircase. The full 18-month timeline dated, documented, the photographs growing larger as they ascended. In the dining room, below the framed portraits of baked patriarchs, stretching back 3 generations, the private meeting photographs, spread like a second genealogy the shadow dynasty Si-hyun had been quietly building in restaurants and hotel rooms and borrowed apartments while his wife ate at that table across from his empty chair. In Myungja's sitting room, Imani mounted the email. She enlarged it to fill an entire section of wall. Every word visible. The passage about the sad painting centered and highlighted. She stood in that room for longer than she intended. She thought about every dinner at which Myungja had suggested, delicately, that a different approach to the grief might help Imani recover more effectively. Every holiday where the conversation had turned, somehow, to the Baek family legacy and the importance of continuation. Every small, graceful, devastating implication that Imani's body had failed at the most fundamental task a Baek wife was expected to perform. She put one additional photograph below the email Myungja and Hae-rin at a restaurant, sharing tea 3 months ago while Imani had been home alone. Then she left the room. In Sai-hyun's study, she removed the framed newspaper profiles from the walls carefully, without damaging them, and replaced them with the financial documents. The housing accounts, the entertainment budgets, the client gift categorizations, the transfer records. She left the profiles stacked neatly on his desk. She left the divorce papers beside them, already signed on her side, with Celeste's contact information paper-clipped to the front. She left the flash drive, containing every digitized piece of evidence, on top of the papers. She left a single handwritten note on top of everything. Congratulations on your new life. I returned the truth to this house before I left. Then she went to the nursery. She had not opened that door since the second miscarriage. She put her hand on the handle and stood there for a moment. She thought about the afternoon. She had chosen the wall color, a pale sage green, not the pink or blue that people assumed, because she hadn't wanted to guess at something so specific before she knew, and because she liked the idea of a room that felt like growing things regardless. She had sat on the floor in that room with paint swatches and a cup of tea, and felt, for one of the only times in her marriage, like the future was genuinely possible. She opened the door inside. Stacked against one wall were Hae-rin's fabric samples, crib catalogs, a mood board for what the room would look like once the pale green was painted over, Gold Star wallpaper samples pinned to a corner. Someone had already measured the windows for new curtains. Imani stood in the doorway and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise name for. Not grief, not anger. Something older and quieter than either the specific ache of a person who has realized, completely, and finally, that the space they tried to fill with love was never actually held for them. She mounted one photograph above the crib catalog. Sai-hyun outside a prenatal clinic, smiling down at Hae-rin's stomach, the kind of smile Imani had never been able to put on his face. Below it, she left 5 words on a strip of white cardstock. This room was not empty. She closed the door. She went back to her bedroom. She changed clothes. She put on her mother's pearls not because they were valuable, though they were, but because they were the one thing in this house that had never belonged to the Bake family, that had come from a woman who had raised Imani to take up space. She took the 2 watercolors from the studio wall. She packed 2 suitcases. Practical. Exact. She had made the list 2 weeks ago and refined it 3 times. She removed her wedding ring and left it on the edge of Sahian's bathroom mirror, where he would see it without looking for it. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom one last time. She did not feel the things she had expected to feel in this moment. No second guessing, no last wave of grief that might undo her plans. What she felt was the peculiar, almost uncomfortable sensation of her own clarity. She walked downstairs She passed through the foyer, without looking at the photographs on the walls. She opened the front door. The driver was already waiting. Imani Delacroix back walked out of the Hanamdong mansion, carrying 2 suitcases, her mother's pearls, and the watercolors she had painted for the children she had lost. She did not look back. She had already said everything that needed saying. She left it on the walls. The driver didn't speak. That was one of the things Imani had specifically requested when she arranged the car through a private service that had no connection to Bak Jin Holdings or any of Sai Hian's affiliated companies. She had paid in advance, given a pickup time, and added 1 note at the bottom of the booking form. No conversation necessary. The man had honored it completely. She sat in the back seat with her 2 suitcases in the trunk and the watercolors laid flat across the seat beside her, wrapped in the same archival tissue she used to protect fragile surfaces during transport. Outside the tinted window, Hanamdong moved past in the pale gray of early morning, the steep residential streets, the high walls, the security cameras mounted above gates that hid houses exactly like the one she had just left. She watched it without feeling much of anything specific. That numbness didn't worry her. She recognized it. It was the same sensation she had in the hours after both miscarriages, before the feeling came back in full and became something she had to manage. The body protecting itself by going quiet. She had about 4 hours before anyone at the mansion would notice anything unusual. Sai Hian was returning from Busan on the afternoon flight. The household staff didn't come in until 9. Myungjia was expected at the mansion by 6 in the evening. The family occasion dinner was scheduled for 7:30. Imani had timed her departure for the longest possible window. She looked at her phone once. There were no messages from Sai Hian. There was one from her assistant at the gallery about a supply delivery scheduled for Thursday that would need to be rescheduled, and one from her friend Priya in London asking if Imani was still planning to stop in London before Copenhagen. She typed back to Priya, "Yes, landing this evening. I'll explain everything when I see you." Then she put the phone face down in her lap and watched Seoul disappear behind her. The mansion didn't register as wrong until 9:47 in the morning. That was when Jisoo, the household manager who had worked for the Bake family for 11 years and prided herself on knowing the specific weight of normal inside that house, walked into the foyer with a supply checklist and stopped so abruptly she dropped her clipboard. She stood beneath the chandelier and looked up at the photograph covering the south wall. Sai Hian and a woman she recognized from several Bake Jin Holdings public events emerging from a hotel elevator. His hand is ring. The woman's face tilted into his. Jisoo stood very still for approximately 15 seconds. Then she walked backward out of the foyer the way a person backs away from something that might be dangerous if startled. She went to the small staff room off the kitchen. She sat down. She picked up her phone and put it back down 3 times before she accepted that there was no version of this situation in which not calling someone was the correct choice. She called Sai Hian's personal assistant, Park Dae-jun. He answered on the second ring. She described what she was looking at in a flat, careful voice, the way she might describe a gas leak or a structural crack, something requiring immediate professional attention that was not, strictly speaking, her area of expertise. Dae-jun was quiet for a moment. "How many photographs?" he said. "I can only see the foyer from where I am," Jisoo said. "I haven't gone further into the house." Another pause. "Don't touch anything," Dae-jun said. "Don't let any other staff inside. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. He did not call back in 10 minutes. He called back in 4, and his voice had changed. The professional steadiness was still there. But underneath it was something compressed and careful, the vocal quality of a man recalibrating very quickly. "I need you to walk through the house," he said. "Tell me every room. Tell me everything you see." Jisoo walked through the house. She described it to Daejun in real time, her voice dropping lower with each room as she came to understand the scale of what Imani had built. The foyer, the staircase. She stopped on the 6th step and said, "It goes all the way up," and her voice was almost entirely flat by then, the flatness of someone suppressing a reaction too complex to name. The dining room. She described the photographs mounted below the framed Bake patriarchs without editorializing, because editorializing was not her role. She stopped at the door to Madame Bake's sitting room. "I think," she said carefully, "this one is for Madame Bake specifically." "What's in it?" Daejun said. "An email, enlarged, and a photograph of Madame Bake and the other woman. At a restaurant. Silence on the line. The study?" Daejun said. She went to the study. She described the financial documents arranged across the walls where Sahyun's press profiles had been. She described the divorce papers on the desk. She described the flash drive and the note. She read the note aloud, once in the same careful flat voice. "Congratulations on your new life. I returned the truth to this house before I left." Daejun did not respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was completely controlled in the way that indicated the opposite of calm. "And the nursery?" Jisoo hesitated. "Haven't been in there." "Go," she went. She opened the door. She saw the fabric samples, the crib catalogs, the gold star wallpaper against the corner. She saw the photograph mounted above everything, and she read the 5 words on the white card below it, and she stood in the doorway of the pale green room for a long moment before she spoke. "You need to call Director Bake," she said. "Now, before anyone else does." Daejun reached Si-hyun at 11:23:40 minutes, before Si-hyun's scheduled departure from Busan. Si-hyun was in a meeting. He stepped out when he saw Daejun's call, because Daejun did not call during meetings except for specific categories of emergency that they had established in advance. He listened without interrupting. When Daejun finished, Si-hyun said, "Is she still in the house?" "No, sir. The staff confirmed her car left before 6 this morning. She has an international flight. I believe she's already out of the country." Silence. "The papers on my desk," Si-hyun said. "They're already signed?" "On her side, yes." Another silence, longer this time. "Who else knows? Currently Jisoo, myself, and you. Keep it that way until I'm back. Nobody enters the house. Nobody speaks to Madame Bake or anyone in the family before I arrive." Si-hyun's voice was even. Completely, mechanically even, in the way Imani had once described to Priya as the scariest register he had not loud, not cold, just flat. Like all the emotion had been rerouted somewhere private, where it was doing something she couldn't see. "Cancel the dinner. The family has already been notified about tonight. Cancel it." "Yes, sir." "And find out who has been sending photographs to the mansion." A pause. "Sir? Someone was sending her photographs for weeks." "I want to know who." Daejun was quiet for a moment. "I'll begin immediately." Si-hyun hung up. He stood in the corridor outside the meeting room in Busan and looked at the wall across from him for approximately 30 seconds. Then he went back inside, made his excuses, collected his jacket, and walked to his car. In the car, he did not call Hae-rin. He did not call his mother. He sat in the back seat for the 3-hour drive back to Seoul and looked out the window and thought about a woman who had spent 8 years learning to read him, his strategies, his timing, his specific style of building a case, before he moved and had used every lesson against him with perfect precision. He thought about the fact that he had encouraged her to take the Copenhagen Fellowship. He thought about the relief on his own face when she accepted. He understood, sitting in the back of the car, that Imani had seen that relief. He understood what it had cost her. He looked out the window for a long time after that. Myungja received the news at 2:15 in the afternoon, not from Daejun and not from Si-hyun, but from her personal driver, whose wife was the sister of one of the Bake household kitchen staff. This was the problem with running a house through people who had worked there long enough to develop lateral loyalties. Information found its own routes. She arrived at the mansion at 3:45, 90 minutes before she had originally planned, and she arrived alone, which was unusual. Myung-ja almost never moved through her son's world without the specific architecture of accompaniment that communicated her position. Jisoo met her at the door. Myung-ja did not look at the foyer photograph immediately. She looked at Jisoo's face first, reading it the way she had learned to read faces in 40 years of navigating a world where weakness was expensive. Then she looked up. She stood beneath the chandelier for a long time. Her expression did not collapse. It sharpened. Sang. There was a difference, and anyone who had spent time around Baek Myung-ja understood it immediately. The sharpening meant she was frightened, and the fact that she was frightened meant she was also beginning to calculate. She walked through the house alone. Jisoo followed at a respectful distance, available but unobtrusive. Myung-ja moved through the foyer, up the staircase, pausing at certain photographs longer than others, particularly the ones with dates visible, the ones that established clear timeline, the ones that placed Hae-rin in locations that could be documented and verified and disclosed. In the dining room, she stood beneath her husband's father's portrait and looked at the private meeting, photographs arranged below it for a long time. Her jaw tightened fractionally, just fractionally. It was the only visible sign. Then she went to her sitting room. Jisoo waited outside. Inside, Myung-ja stood before the enlarged email for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Jisoo counted, not from any deliberate intention, but because the silence was so complete that time became audible. When Myung-ja came out, her face had rearranged itself into something controlled and particular. The sharpening had settled into something more deliberate. "Where is my son?" she said, "En route from Busan, madam. He should arrive within the hour." "And Hae-rin?" Jisoo hesitated precisely long enough for Myung-ja to note the hesitation. "I haven't been in contact with Ms. Yoon, madam." Myung-ja looked at her. "Has she been told?" "I don't know." Myung-ja moved toward the sitting room, phoned the landline, which she still used for conversations she considered private. She stopped. She looked at the phone. She looked back toward the closed door of her sitting room, where the email was still mounted across the wall, every word visible, the sentence about the sad paintings, centered and enlarged. She did not pick up the phone. She sat down in the chair by the window instead, which Jisoo had never seen her do without being offered tea first, and she sat there looking at nothing visible for a long time. Sae-hyun arrived at 4:58. He came in through the side entrance rather than the main door, a habit from years of operational security, entering his own house through secondary access points when he didn't know what was waiting inside. He had the specific still-face quality of a man who has spent a 3-hour car ride deciding exactly how to hold himself when the moment arrived. He stood in the foyer and looked up at the photograph. His own face, his own hand, his own ring, on the wall of his own house. Something moved across his expression, not guilt, not anger, not grief exactly, but something that contained all three and was controlled by none of them. Something that looked, for a brief moment, like recognition. Then it closed. He went through the house methodically, the same way Myung-ja had, though faster, his eyes moving over each room with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing damage for actionable intelligence rather than personal reckoning. The staircase timeline, the dining room, the study. He stood at his desk for a long time. He picked up Celeste Monroe Hahn's business card from the paperclip documents. He set it down. He picked up the flash drive and turned it over in his fingers once, then set it back exactly where it had been. He read the note. He read it again. He set it face down on the desk and did not read it a third time. He went to the nursery last. He stood in the doorway without going in. He looked at the photograph above the crib catalog himself. Outside the clinic, a sound like green splitting, smiling in the specific, uncomplicated way of a man who had allowed himself to be happy about something before he had resolved the damage that happiness required. And he looked at the 5 words below it, and his face did something complicated and brief that Jisoo, watching from the end of the corridor, couldn't fully read. He pulled the nursery door closed without going inside. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the counter drinking it in measured sips, the way a person regulates their own breathing. Myungja came in. She sat at the kitchen table without being asked, which was itself a statement. Myungja did not sit in kitchens. They looked at each other. "She's gone," Sae-hyun said. "I know, the papers are signed." "I know that too." "Silence, the email," Sae-hyun said. "Yes," Myungja said. "You knew she wrote it." His mother was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive quiet of someone constructing a denial, the heavier quiet of someone deciding how much honesty the situation could absorb. "I saw it when she sent it. I didn't ask her to remove it." Sayan set his glass down on the counter. "You didn't ask her to remove it." "I had other concerns at the time. Her paintings," Sae-hyun said. "The ones she made after the miscarriages." Myungja looked at the table. "Those paintings were the only things in this house that were entirely hers," Sae-hyun said. "Not purchased with Baekjin money. Not chosen for the aesthetic of the Baek family. Hers. And you read an email calling them sad and suggesting they be thrown out, and you didn't say anything." "I didn't throw them out. You didn't say anything." His mother lifted her eyes. Her face, when she met his, was not defensive. It was something more difficult than defensive. It was the face of a woman who had made a specific calculation and was now being required to look at the arithmetic in full. "I wanted this resolved," she said. "I wanted the family to continue. I made choices." That she stopped. "That what?" "That I understood differently at the time," she said, which was as close to admission as Sae-hyun had ever heard from her, and the smallness of it, the absolute insufficiency of it, landed between them and stayed there. Sae-hyun looked at his mother for a long time. Then he turned back to the window. "The dinner is cancelled," he said. "I need you to contact Do-yun before someone else does. Tell him there's been a development with the Baekjin accounts that requires a family conversation. Don't mention Imani. Don't mention Hae-rin. I'll explain everything when he arrives." Myungja was quiet. "Your father will want to see the financial documents." "I know," Sae-hyun. Her voice shifted, not softer but more careful, the register of someone choosing terrain precisely. "This can still be managed." He turned from the window and looked at her, and the expression on his face stopped her before she could continue. "She left copies with 3 separate parties," he said. "Her attorney, an attorney in New York, and a third contact she hasn't identified. Every financial record, every transfer, every categorization." He paused. "She also left a message through her attorney that any attempt to characterize her publicly as unstable, vindictive, or responsible for the marriage's failure will result in immediate legal disclosure." Myungja absorbed this. "She planned this for months," she said. "Longer," Sae-hyun said. "Probably since the photographs started arriving." "Who sent the photographs?" He looked at her. "I'm trying to find out." His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Hae-rin. He let it ring twice. 3 times. On the 4th ring, he answered and walked out of the kitchen, leaving his mother sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her and the specific stillness of a woman recalibrating in real time. Hae-rin had found out through a mutual contact 2 hours earlier. The mutual contact was an assistant at a Baekjin subsidiary who had heard from someone with a connection to the household staff, the same lateral network that had reached Myungja, only it had taken longer to reach Hae-rin because nobody in Sae-hyun's immediate circle had thought to call her first. That, like green wood splitting, that fact that nobody had called her first was the first piece of information that told her something important about her position in this situation. She had spent the 2 hours since hearing the news in her apartment, which was a full floor of a Yongsan building that she had believed was a private arrangement between herself and Sae-hyun, and was now apparently documented as a line item in a Baekjin subsidiary account. Which meant it was evidence. Which meant her home was evidence. She stood in her living room with her phone in her hand, and her hand resting against her stomach, in the unconscious way she had developed over the past 4 months, and she called Sae-hyun for the 3rd time, and this time he answered. "Where are you?" she said. "The house." "She's gone?" "Yes." Sae-hyun. Her voice had a particular texture, not hysterical, not cold, but something tightly wound between them. "There are photographs of us. My contact said I've seen them. The apartment is documented." "I know. The prenatal appointments." "Hae-rin. His voice was quiet in the way that meant stop. She stopped. I'm handling it. Handling it. She repeated it back to him without inflection and then waited, and the waiting itself was a kind of pressure. There will be a legal process, he said. It will take time. You don't need to do anything right now. Your father is going to find out tonight. Silence. Sahyun. Your father is coming tonight, and he is going to walk through that house and see photographs of me and financial documentation, and the dinner is canceled. That doesn't mean he won't find out. He'll find out when I tell him, Sahyun said, on my timeline. Your timeline. Again, that flat repetition. I'm 4 months pregnant. This is my timeline, too. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that Hayrin understood something in it, not cruelty, which she could have managed. Something more disorienting, the sound of a man who was, in this moment, managing 17 different problems and had placed her in a specific position in that list that was not as high as she had believed she was. I'll come to you tonight, he said, after my father. After your father, she said. Yes, she ended the call. Slitting. She stood in the middle of her living room, the apartment she had chosen herself, that she had furnished herself, that she had made into something that felt like it belonged to her, and she understood for the first time with complete clarity that her name was not on the lease. Her name was not on any document connected to this apartment. Every arrangement that made her life comfortable in this city ran through Sahyun's decisions, Sahyun's accounts, Sahyun's organizational structures. She was 4 months pregnant with his child, and she did not have independent legal claim to the floor she was standing on. She sat down on the couch. She put both hands on her stomach. She stayed there for a long time, thinking about what it meant to have positioned yourself as the woman a powerful man chose, and to realize in the same afternoon that being chosen and being protected were not the same thing and had never been the same thing, and that the woman who had just left the country had understood that distinction for considerably longer than Hayrin had. Baek Do-yoon arrived at 6:45. He had not been told the dinner was canceled. Either Myung-ja had been unable to reach him, or had chosen not to, which in Do-yoon's world amounted to the same thing. He arrived with 2 family associates, both senior in the Baek organization's legitimate corporate structure, both expecting a celebration. He was 71 years old and carried his age the way certain men do, not hidden, not apologized for, simply worn like a coat that fit exactly because it had been broken in over decades of specific use. He had built Baek Jin Holdings from a regional freight operation into the legitimate empire it now was. And he had handed a significant portion of its control to his son with the specific understanding that the empire would be maintained with the discipline that had built it. He walked through the front door and stopped. He looked at the foyer wall for a long moment. He turned to the associate on his right, a man named Choi, who handled Baek Jin's corporate compliance, and said quietly and without expression, "Wait outside." Choi and the second associate went back through the door without a word. Do-yoon walked through the house alone. He did not rush. He moved up the staircase at an even pace, reading each photograph the way he had read contracts for 50 years completely, without skipping, without allowing his reaction to get ahead of his comprehension. He went through the dining room. He did not go into Myung-ja's sitting room. He went directly to Sahyun's study. Sahyun was there, standing at the window. Do-yoon picked up the divorce papers and read the first page. He set them down. He looked at the financial documents on the wall, the housing accounts, the entertainment categorizations, the transfer records. He stood before them the way a man stands, before an accounting he has been handed, without warning, and reads it anyway, to the end, because not reading it doesn't make it not exist. He set the documents down. He looked at his son. Sion met his eyes. "She left this morning," Sahyun said. "I can see that." Do-yoon's voice was even. Completely. Quietly even. "The financial transfers." "I can explain." "I'm not asking for an explanation," Do-yoon said. "I'm telling you that I can see them." Sahyun was quiet. "Baek Jin accounts," his father said. "Corporate entertainment. Subsidiary housing." He paused. "You used the company's money to manage a personal arrangement, and now that arrangement is documented, and in the possession of at least one attorney whose primary interest is not this family's welfare. I understand the exposure, do you?" It wasn't a question. Then you understand that if her attorney chooses disclosure, the compliance audit we spent 18 months building to protect this company from regulatory attention becomes a secondary document to evidence of internal account misuse. Saihan said nothing. Who else has this? Duyan asked. Her attorney, an attorney in New York. A third party I haven't identified. His father looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and Doyen was a man to understand that discomfort was sometimes the most precise eye tool available. Then you should have ended your marriage before you dishonored it, he said. The sentence landed without volume and without particular heat, which made it worse. Saihin's phone rang. He looked at the screen, Celeste Monroe Han. He answered it on speaker, a decision made in half a second that he would later understand as the moment the ground shifted, completely beneath everything he had been planning. Celeste's voice came through the speaker with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who has made this call many times and has learned that efficiency is its own form of authority. Mr. Bake, my client has asked me to confirm receipt of the divorce filing and to communicate several conditions. First, the financial documentation in your possession and in your study has been submitted as supporting evidence in the filing. Second, any public statement through media, family channels, organizational communications, or personal communication that characterizes Mrs. Bake Delacroix as mentally unstable, culturally incompatible, or in any way responsible for the dissolution of this marriage will trigger immediate disclosure of all financial documentation to the relevant regulatory bodies. Third, my client is available through this office only. She is not available by phone, in person, or through any intermediary. Sion said nothing. Mr. Leste said, I want to be very clear. My client spent 8 years in this marriage with complete loyalty. She is not angry. She is finished. There is a significant difference, and I would encourage you to understand it before you make any decisions about how to respond. Duyun was watching his son. Saihin looked at the flash drive on the desk. Where is she? He said. She is no longer available to carry the consequences of your decisions, Celeste said. The call ended. The study was very quiet. Duyun looked at the wall of financial documents, then at his son, then at the divorce papers on the desk with Imani's signature already on them, clean and final, with the date splitting, with the date written beneath it in the careful hand of a woman who had been precise about everything. I want a full audit, Doyun said, internal, beginning Monday. You will step back from the Baekjin corporate operations until it's complete. He paused. And the woman. Sihin looked at his father. She is carrying your child, Duyun said, without softness and without cruelty. That is a fact that exists regardless of how this situation resolves. But she will not be introduced to this family through a scandal. Whatever arrangement you make with her will be made privately after the audit, after the divorce is finalized, and after you have demonstrated to me that you understand the difference between what you want and what this family can absorb. He picked up his jacket from the back of Saihyun's chair. Call your mother, he said. She needs to understand that whatever she knew and didn't act on that conversation is coming. Not tonight, but it's coming. He walked to the door. He stopped. Without turning around, he said, the note she left. On the desk. Sayan didn't answer. She was right, Do-yun said. About all of it. Then he walked out, and his footsteps crossed the foyer, and the front door opened and closed. And Saihin stood alone in his study, and stood alone, surrounded by the financial architecture of his own choices mounted across the walls, like a verdict that had already been delivered. In a house his wife had spent one morning turning into something he could not negotiate with, intimidate, or survive without consequence. He reached out and picked up the note. He read it once more. Congratulations on your new life. I returned the truth to this house before I left. He set it down. He looked at the wall. And for the first time in a career built on, knowing exactly what move came next, Baek Si-hin stood in a room where every wall showed him a version of himself he could not argue with, and he did not know what to do. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the quiet of a house at rest, the quiet of a house that has been emptied of something essential and hasn't yet decided what it is without that thing. Saihan had lived inside noise his entire adult life. The noise of organization, of strategy meetings and late calls, and the specific ambient sound of power maintaining itself. This silence had a different texture. It pressed against the ears the way silence does when it means something. He stood in his study for a long time after his father left. The note was still on the desk, face down, where he'd set it. He didn't turn it over again. He didn't need to. He had the words memorized now in the way you memorize something that arrives at exactly the right pitch to cut through all the professional insulation you've spent years building around yourself. I returned the truth to this house before I left. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a moment, then put it down without calling anyone. There was nobody to call who would tell him something he needed to hear, rather than something they calculated he wanted to hear. That was the specific cost of the kind of authority he had built the people around him had learned to be useful, not honest. The two things were not the same thing, and he understood that with a clarity tonight that he had spent years avoiding. He went to the window. Below the hill, Seoul was fully lit, doing what Seoul did in the evening, moving, crowded, indifferent. The city had no particular feeling about Baek Sion's marriage or its dissolution. The city had no particular feeling about anything except its own momentum. He stayed at the window until he heard Myungja's footsteps in the corridor. She knocked twice. He didn't answer, and she came in anyway, which she hadn't done in years, which was told him she was operating outside her normal parameters tonight. She sat in the chair across from his desk, not the chair she usually chose, which was angled slightly toward the door, a position she had maintained in every room for 40 years. She sat in the chair directly opposite him, which meant she had decided this was a conversation requiring full exposure. He turned from the window. They looked at each other, the way people look at each other when all the comfortable pretenses have been removed, and what remains is just the actual relationship, undecorated. "Your father called me from the car," she said. "I know. He said the same thing to me he said to you. About what I knew." She folded her hands in her lap. Her hands were still. His mother's hands were always still. It was a form of discipline she had practiced so long it looked natural. He used a specific word. "I won't repeat it." Si-hyun looked at her. "The email," he said. "I know. You read it when she sent it." "Yes. And you said nothing to Hae-rin about removing it. You didn't tell her it was a problem." He stopped. "You let it stay in her sent folder as documentation of what the two of you thought about Imani's grief." Myungja was quiet for a moment. Not defensive, something more troubling than defensive, because defensiveness would have been easier to manage. She was doing something Si-hyun had seen her do very rarely in his life. She was sitting inside the discomfort of something she had done without trying to immediately reframe it as someone else's misunderstanding. "I made a calculation," she said finally. "What kind of calculation?" "That the marriage was already finished. That the faster it ended, the less damage there would be. That Imani—" She stopped. "Say it." "That Imani had become someone the family couldn't build around anymore. After the miscarriages. After she withdrew." Her voice was careful, precise. "Not cruel. Worse than cruel, convinced. I was wrong about that. I understand now that I was wrong about that. But at the time I made a calculation, and the email fit inside it." Si-hyun looked at his mother for a long time. "She didn't withdraw," he said. "She was grieving. There is a difference. I know that now." "Did you know it then?" His mother didn't answer. "Because I think you knew it then," he said. "I think you knew and you made a different calculation. That grief was inconvenient. That Hae-rin was straightforward. That a younger Korean woman carrying a Baek heir was less complicated than an American wife who was taking too long to recover from losing 2 pregnancies. Myungja's hands tightened fractionally in her lap. "You are not entirely without responsibility in this." "I know exactly what my responsibility is," Si-hyun said. "I'm not talking about mine. I'm talking about yours." Specifically, she looked at the desk. She looked at the divorce papers. "The nursery walls," she said quietly. He didn't answer. "I remember when she chose them. That color," she paused. "I thought it was strange. Not pink, not blue. I remember thinking," she stopped again. "You thought it was another thing about her that didn't fit," Si-hyun said. His mother closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she said, "Yes." The word cost her something visible. Saihan watched it cost her and didn't fill the silence after it, because the silence was necessary and his mother needed to sit inside it without rescue. After a moment, she stood. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing tonight." He turned back to the window. "Go home. Don't speak to Hei Rin. Don't speak to any of the family associates until I've spoken to them first. And find someone to remove the photographs tomorrow. Carefully, without damaging anything." She was almost at the door when he spoke again. "The paintings she made, after the miscarriages." His mother stopped. "She took them with her," he said. "She carried them to the airport herself." "So Heirin's suggestion is moot." He paused. "But I want you to understand something. Those paintings were the only things in this house that cost Imani something real to make. Everything else she brought here, the restoration work, the professional reputation, the 8 years of learning to exist, inside a world that was never designed for her. She managed all of that with competence. The paintings cost her something different, and the woman you were planning to replace her with suggested throwing them away, and you read that suggestion and moved on with your day." Myungja stood at the door with her back to him. "I know," she said. "I'm not saying it for your benefit," he said. "I'm saying it so it exists in a room out loud. So neither of us can pretend it was a small thing." His mother left. The study was quiet again. Saiyan sat at his desk, in front of the financial documents, arranged across the walls of his own office, and began the particular work of understanding exactly how much damage had been done, and in how many directions. It took Kwon Jae-wook's replacement, a man named Lim, that Dae-jun had found within 48 hours of Saihin's order to trace the photograph source, exactly 9 days to find the answer. He presented it to Saiyan on a Thursday morning, in a document that was 4 pages long and included 3 photographs of his own. Saihin read the first page. He read it again. He set the document down on the desk and looked at the wall across from him, bare now, the financial papers removed, the press profiles back in their frames. Everything restored to the appearance of normal, and he breathed in and out twice before he picked the document back up. The person who had been sending photographs to the mansion was not someone inside a rival organization. It was not a disgruntled employee. It was not someone with a political grudge against Baekjin Holdings. It was Park Sung-min, Saihin's deputy director, his second in command for 6 years. The man who had run the Busan operations with such reliable competence that Saihin had considered him the operational backbone of the entire organization. The man he had trusted with information that was not in any document, any file, any legal record information that existed only in the private understanding between a boss and the person he relied on to be an extension of his authority. Sung-min had been sending photographs to Imani for 11 weeks. Lim's document showed how a secondary phone, a service he had routed through an address, in Incheon, timing that coordinated with the security rotation changes he himself had approved. He had been photographing Sai Hyun and Hei-rin for months before he began sending the images, building the archive with the specific patience of a man who understood that evidence was only useful once you had enough of it. Saihan read through to the end of the document. The last page contained 3 photographs taken by Lim's surveillance of Sung-min's movements. In the first, Sung-min was entering a building in Gangnam. In the second, he was leaving the same building, with a woman Si-hyun didn't recognize. In the third, he was at a restaurant with Choi, the same Choi, who handled Baekjin's corporate compliance, and who had arrived with Do-yun for the cancelled dinner. Si-hyun looked at the third photograph for a long time. He picked up his phone and called Dae-jun. "Sung-min," he said. "And Choi. When did they start meeting regularly?" A pause. "I can check that. Don't check anything yet. Just tell me, do you know of any recent meeting between them that wasn't logged in the organizational calendar?" Dae-jun was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough for Saihin to understand that Dae-jun knew something and was deciding how to present it. "There was a dinner," Dae-jun said carefully, "6 weeks ago. Private. I was aware of it because Sung-min's driver logged the mileage, and I review the transport accounts. I didn't flag it because both men have legitimate reasons to dine privately." "Why didn't you flag it to me?" "Because at the time I had no reason to connect it to anything requiring your attention." A pause. I understand now that was incorrect. Sai-Hyun set the document down. I need to know everything Sung-min has accessed in the past 4 months, he said. Financial records, personnel files, the Busan account structures. Everything. Quietly. Before he knows I'm looking. Understood, Dae-jun said. How long do I have? 48 hours. I'll need 72-60. The call ended. Sai-Hyun sat back in his chair. He thought about Sung-min. 6 years of operational trust. The man had never shown ambition above his role, or had appeared not to. The appearance of contentment was something Sai-Hyun had specifically valued because it suggested stability. He understood now that he had confused appearance with fact, which was a mistake he had spent his career training other people not to make. He thought about Choi. He thought about the compliance audit his father had ordered. He thought about the timing of all 3 things, the photographs sent to Imani, Sung-min's private dinners with Choi, the internal audit now underway, and he felt the structure of something assembling itself in his understanding. The shape of a problem that was larger and older than his marriage, and had been using his marriage as a convenient distraction. He stood up. He needed to move. He thought better when he moved, always had. He walked out of the study, through the foyer past the blank walls where the photographs had been, the adhesive marks still faintly visible, small pale rectangles that would need repainting, and out through the side door into the garden. It was cold. He hadn't brought a coat. He stood on the stone path and breathed cold air and thought with the focused speed he used when a situation was moving faster than his preparation. Sung-min had sent photographs to Imani. Sung-min had also been meeting privately with Choi from corporate compliance. The compliance audit ordered by Do-yeon had begun Monday. If Sung-min had advanced knowledge of what was in the Baekjin accounts, because he had helped structure some of those accounts, and if Choi was the person responsible for ensuring those accounts survived regulatory scrutiny, then what Sung-min had done by sending the photographs was not an act of conscience or loyalty to Imani. It was a detonator. He had used Sai-Hyun's affair, used Imani's justified devastation as a mechanism to force exactly this outcome: the divorce filing, the financial exposure, the internal audit, Sion's removal from corporate operations. All of it producing the specific conditions under which someone positioned correctly inside Baekjin Holdings could move. Sion stood in the cold and understood that he had been played by his own second-in-command, and that Imani had been an unwitting instrument in it, and that the woman he had betrayed had also been used her pain, her evidence, her careful and devastating exit as the first move in someone else's strategy. He went back inside. He sat at his desk. He called one number, not Dae-jun, not Lim, not anyone inside Baekjin. A private number, stored in a phone that lived in a locked drawer, and was registered to a name that didn't connect to him through any document he was aware of. A number for a man named Cha who handled specific problems that required the kind of attention you couldn't log in an organizational calendar. I need a full background on Park Sung-min, starting from before he joined the organization, Sion said. Every previous employer, every prior financial relationship, particular attention to any connection to the Choi family or associated corporate entities. Timeline? Shah said yesterday. He put that phone away. Then he opened his laptop and wrote a message to Celeste Monroe Han's office. The message was short. It said that he wished to communicate to his wife through appropriate legal channels, with no expectation of direct contact that she should be aware. There were individuals connected to Baekjin Holdings whose interest in her divorce was not limited to goodwill, and that any evidence in her possession should be treated as potentially of interest to parties beyond the immediate family settlement. He read it back. He deleted it. He couldn't send a message like that through Celeste's office without it becoming part of the legal record. He couldn't contact Imani directly. Her attorney had made that entirely clear, and Imani had made it clearer. A sound like green wood splitting. He couldn't protect her from something she didn't know existed without revealing that he knew about it, which would raise questions he couldn't answer without implicating himself further. He sat at the desk with his hands flat on the surface. Imani was in Copenhagen with evidence that was now potentially useful to people who wanted to use it for something other than her divorce settlement. She didn't know that. He couldn't tell her. And the man who had orchestrated the entire thing was currently running the Busan operations with 6 years of accumulated access to everything Saihian had built. Daejun delivered the preliminary account access report in 51 hours. He set it on Sai Saihan's desk without speaking and stood back and waited. And Sai and Sihan read through it page by page with the specific stillness of a man absorbing information that is confirming something he had already half understood and still hoped was wrong. Sungmin Sat had accessed the Busan account structures 4 months ago, 1 week before the first photograph was sent to the mansion. He had pulled internal records on 3 subsidiary accounts: the housing account, covering Hairin's apartment, the entertainment budget used for their dinners and travel, and a third account that had nothing to do with the affair. A development account connected to a logistics expansion in Incheon, structured in a way that Sungmin had himself recommended 18 months ago, and that Saihyun had approved without examining the specific account architecture in detail because he had trusted the man recommending it. Saihin turned to the section on the Incheon account. He read for 12 minutes without looking up. The Incheon account had been set up with a parallel withdrawal structure that Sungmin had embedded in the original documentation, subtle, technically legal on its face, invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. Over 18 months, a series of authorized appearing transfers had moved a significant sum through the subsidiary's operational costs into an account Saihian didn't recognize. He set the report down. The total, he said. Daejun told him. The number was large enough to explain a great deal about why Sungmin had needed the audit triggered under these specific conditions, seen with Sihan already removed from corporate operations and the organization's attention divided between the divorce scandal and the internal review. The audit would find the Baekjin accounts misused for the affair. It would flag them. It would create a significant period of scrutiny. And during that period, the Incheon account, slightly different structure, slightly different compliance pathway, would either pass through or be examined by Choi, who handled corporate compliance, who had been having private dinners with Sungmin. Saihan understood the whole shape of it now. He had been robbed. Methodically, patiently, from inside his own organization, by a man he had trusted absolutely. And the mechanism used to create the conditions for the theft was Saihin's own infidelity, his affair, his choices, his failure to end his marriage before he dishonored it, exactly as his father had said. Sungmin hadn't needed to create the affair. He had only needed to wait for it. And then he had handed a camera and a delivery schedule to Saihan's wife's grief and used her devastation as his detonator. Saihan stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He thought about Imani sitting in the tea house across from Kwon Jae-wook, spreading photographs across the table and asking for the financial picture. He thought about the careful, methodical way. She had documented everything the same way he had always documented his own cases before he moved. He thought about how he had told himself, in the car from Busan, that she had learned from watching him. She had, but so had Sungmin, and Sungmin had been watching longer. "Where is he now?" Sihyun said. "Busan. He's been there for the past week." "Is he where we're looking?" "I don't believe so. But if he has eyes in the compliance department, and if Choi has communicated anything about the audit's focus, he may have an approximate timeline." Saihin turned from the window. His face was composed in the flat, rerouted way that Imani had once described to Priya as frightening all the emotion redirected somewhere private, doing something nobody outside could see. "Pull him back to Seoul," he said. "Routine operational review. Make it look like standard audit-related procedure. 3 other regional directors get the same notice today. Give him no reason to accelerate whatever timeline he's working on." "And Choi?" Saihin thought for a moment. "Leave Choi in place. If he's in communication with Sungmin, I want that channel open. I want to know what Sungmin tells him when he gets the notice." Daejun nodded. "The Incheon account. Freeze it quietly. Create a technical error, a banking system flag, something procedural. It needs to look like compliance bureaucracy, not intentional seizure." He paused. "Can you do that within the audit infrastructure?" "I'll need someone in the compliance department who isn't Choi." "Find one. Someone clean. Junior is fine." "Understood." One more thing, Saiyan looked at the report on his desk. The account Sungmin has been moving money into. I need a full owner trace. Daejun hesitated. Just slightly. Sir, if the owner trace goes deep enough, there's a possibility it connects to interests outside our sector. Saihin looked at him. How far outside? I'm speculating, Daejun said carefully. But the structure of the receiving account has characteristics that my predecessor, the previous financial director, flagged once in connection with certain Gangnam-based investment vehicles. He didn't pursue it. The connection may be coincidental. It may be, Saihyun said. Trace it anyway. Daejun left. Sian stood alone in the study with the preliminary report on the desk and the framed press profiles back on the walls and the faint adhesive outlines of Imani's photographs still visible if you looked at the right angle in the right light. He thought about Cha's investigation into Sungmin's prior history. He thought about what it meant if the receiving account connected to something larger than one deputy director's private ambition. He thought about the Incheon expansion. 18 months ago, Sungmin had recommended it. He had approved it. He had trusted the man's judgment because the man had earned trust over 6 years of reliable performance. He understood now that the 6 years had been the investment. Sungmin had spent 6 years building Sian's trust with the specific intention of this moment, or something like this moment, this particular configuration of vulnerability. All he had needed was a scandal large enough to trigger the conditions, and he had found it without having to create it. Sian had handed it to him. He picked up the private phone again. This time he called a different number, a contact in a financial intelligence firm that worked adjacent to Korean regulatory bodies and owed him a very old favor. I need a quiet preliminary trace on an offshore account structure, he said. Nothing formal, nothing logged. I need to know if it connects to any entities that have been flagged in the past 7 years in the Gangnam investment sector. He gave the account details. How fast? The contact said. As fast as you can move without leaving tracks. The call ended. He sat down. He opened the laptop. He pulled up the Copenhagen Museum's website, not with any particular intention, just because he needed to see something that had nothing to do with any of this. And her name was listed in the visiting conservator section, Imani Delacroix, Provenance and Restoration, currently leading the 19th century portrait project. He looked at her name on the screen. He thought about the 5 words she had left in the nursery. He thought about what it meant that the man who had orchestrated his marriage's public destruction was currently sitting in Busan with 6 years of access to the organization's architecture, waiting for the audit to run its designed course, while Saihin's father was overseeing the review, and Choi was embedded in the compliance structure. He thought about what it meant that Imani had evidence in 3 separate locations that was now potentially interesting to people who wanted access to Baekjin's financial infrastructure. He thought about the fact that he had no way to warn her that could not be used against him. He closed the laptop. The situation had moved beyond what he had prepared for, not because he had failed to anticipate damage, but because the damage had a different architect than he had assumed, and the architect had been sitting inside his organization for 6 years eating dinner at Saihyun's table and managing his operations with impeccable visible competence while building something else entirely in the spaces between. He had been preparing to manage the consequences of his own failures. He had not been prepared for the possibility that his failures had been surveilled and cultivated by someone who needed them. He sat at his desk in the quiet house, with the city lit below the hill, and understood that the problem he was now inside was not a marital scandal, not a financial exposure, not a family reckoning. It was all of those things simultaneously. Each one connected to the others, each one made worse, by his attempt to manage the previous one. And at the center of it, a man who had used Cyan's love for a woman he had failed to protect as the first instrument of a strategy that had been running for 18 months while Cyan looked in the wrong direction. His phone rang. Cha, he answered. The prior employment, Cha said without preamble. Before he joined your organization. There's a gap of 14 months that doesn't appear in any documentation he submitted. What's in the gap? That's the problem, Cha said. Nothing official. But the financial firm he supposedly left, before that gap, I spoke to someone there who remembered him. He didn't leave voluntarily. He was asked to leave after an internal review flagged irregularities in a client account structure he had recommended. A pause. The review was conducted by a compliance officer named Choi. Cyan was very still. He said. Different generation, Cha said. The father, Sai-hyun, looked at the wall across from him. They've known each other for over a decade, he said. At minimum, Cha said, the relationship predates your organization by years. Whatever Sungmin is doing, Choi has been part of the planning since before either of them was inside Baekjin Holdings. Cyan set the phone down on the desk without ending the call. He sat with that information for a moment. Two men. A decade of prior relationship. A shared history involving account irregularities and an internal review. Both of them subsequently entering Sehin's organization at different times, through different channels. Through referrals, Sehin was now realizing he had never traced back with sufficient rigor and spending years building access and trust from the inside. It was not opportunism. It was architecture. He picked the phone back up. One more thing. The Incheon account receiving structure. Does it have any ownership overlap with the firm where Sungmin worked before the gap? A pause. Look, Sai-hyun says. He ended the call. He stood up from the desk for the second time and walked to the window and stood there, looking at Sesol and understanding that the house he was standing in, the organization he had built, the marriage he had destroyed, and the woman currently in Copenhagen, with evidence that three parties held all of it, was now entangled in something that had been designed specifically to be entangled, by people who had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right configuration of damage before they moved. He was no longer managing a personal crisis. He was managing a threat to everything. And the one person who held evidence that could either protect Baekjin's position or accelerate its destruction, depending on how it was used, and by whom was a woman he had failed completely, who had no reason to trust a single thing he said, and who was standing in front of a 19th century portrait in Copenhagen, becoming someone she had been trying to become for 8 years, while he stood at a window, in Seoul realizing he had just lost control of. Something far larger than he had known he was inside. Sungmin arrived in Seoul on a Wednesday. He came in on the afternoon train rather than flying, which Dijun noted in the tracking report, and flagged without commentary. A man who drives to the station and buys a train ticket instead of using the organizational car service and the company account is a man who wants a record that looks slightly different from his usual pattern. Not dramatically different, just different, to suggest he was thinking about records. Sai-hyun read the flag at 7 in the morning, before anyone else was in the building. He had been in the office since 5:30. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours and his body knew it. There was a specific heaviness behind his eyes that wasn't quite pain, more like pressure, like the inside of his skull had swollen slightly against its own walls. He had been running on coffee and the particular focused energy that comes not from rest but from the body's deciding that rest is not currently an option and reconfiguring accordingly. He had spent the previous 48 hours reading everything Dae-jun and Cha and the financial intelligence contact had assembled, and what he had assembled in return was a picture that was, in its completed form, almost elegant in the way a trap is elegant. You don't see its elegance until you're already inside it. Sungmin and Choi had entered Baekjin Holdings 14 months apart through unconnected referral channels, with no documented prior relationship. The prior relationship existed anyway, stretching back 11 years to a financial firm, where a young account manager with a talent for complex account structures had been quietly pushed out after an internal review, flagged irregularities, a review conducted by the firm's compliance head, a man named Choi Byung-soo, who was the father of the Choi, now sitting in Baekjin's corporate compliance department. The son had entered Baekjin 4 years before Sungmin. He had spent those 4 years building exactly the position needed: corporate compliance, internal audit oversight, the specific role that sat between organizational operations and regulatory exposure. The role that determined what got flagged and what got managed quietly. Sungmin had arrived afterward and spent 6 years building Sai-hyun's trust from the inside. The Incheon account, the development account, Sungmin, had recommended and helped structure connected through 2 shell layers to an investment vehicle registered in Singapore. The Singapore vehicle had a beneficial ownership that Cha's contact traced, after considerable effort, to a holding company with interests in logistics infrastructure across 3 countries. The holding company had a board member who had been publicly associated in a financial press piece from 4 years ago with a consortium attempting to acquire logistics routes in the Korean peninsula that Baekjin Holdings currently controlled. Someone wanted Baekjin's infrastructure, not the criminal organization. The legitimate one, the logistics routes, the property holdings, the corporate infrastructure that Saihyun's father had spent 50 years building and that Saihyun had maintained and expanded. The kind of infrastructure that wasn't available for purchase as long as the family maintained control. The kind that became available if the controlling family was weakened sufficiently by internal scandal, regulatory scrutiny, and a succession crisis, created by the right combination of financial exposure and leadership removal. Saihyun had read this picture at 2 in the morning and sat with it until 4, not moving, just understanding it fully, the way you have to understand something completely before you can decide what to do about it. Then he had come to the office and started making calls. Sung-min walked into the Baekjin corporate building at 2:15 in the afternoon. He was dressed the way he always dressed well, precisely, without ostentation. He carried a slim briefcase. He nodded to the front desk with the familiar ease of a man who had walked into this building hundreds of times. His face was composed and professional, and gave away nothing, which was itself something because a man who has nothing to hide doesn't work that hard at having nothing to show. Saihyun watched him come through security on the monitor in the conference room. Dejun was standing behind Saihyun's left shoulder. Cha was against the far wall, near the door, in the way that people who do Cha's kind of work stand near doors present but positioned, available but not obtrusive. He took the stairs, Dejun said, watching the secondary monitor. I know, Saihyun stood. Give me 5 minutes with him first. Then come in. He walked to the conference room door, opened it, and stood in the corridor as Sung-min came around the corner from the stairwell exit. Sung-min saw him, and his pace didn't change a fraction of a second's recalibration, almost imperceptible, and then the same smooth professional stride. Director Baek, he said. Sung-min. Saihyun stepped back and gestured toward the conference room. Come in. They sat across from each other at the long table. Saihyun had specifically not put documents on the table. Nothing visible. Just 2 men in a room, which was its own kind of pressure, because it gave Sung-min nothing to read except Saihyun's face, and Saihyun had spent 40 years making his face very difficult to read. Thank you for coming back early, Saihyun said. How were things in Busan? Stable. Sung-min set his briefcase against the leg of his chair. The audit notice came at a reasonable time. We had just completed the quarterly reconciliation, so the documentation is clean. Good. Saihyun looked at him. How long have you known Choi Byung-soo? Pause was very small, less than a second. But Saihyun had been watching for exactly that pause, and he saw it the way a surgeon sees what he's looking for, not with surprise, but with the specific satisfaction of confirmation. The compliance director? Sung-min said. His Saihyun said. Sung-min's expression didn't move. It was a professional-grade stillness, the kind that takes practice, and the practice itself was information. I'm not sure I know him, Sung-min said. You worked for him, Saihyun said. For 2 years, before the internal review. A beat. That was a long time ago, Sung-min said. 11 years. Saihyun kept his voice even. You're right, it was. Long enough to plan something careful. He paused. The Inchin account. Sung-min looked at him. For the first time, something moved beneath his composed surface, not fear exactly, but a recalculation, the internal machinery adjusting to a new input. The audit will review it, Sung-min said. The audit will review the version you wanted it to review, Saihyun said. I've had a parallel trace running for 72 hours. I know where it goes. He leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed, but giving Sung-min the appearance of space, which was its own form of pressure. I know about Singapore. I know about the consortium. I know about the board member. Sung-min was quiet. What I don't know yet, Saihyun said, is exactly when they recruited you. whether it was before or after you joined this organization. He paused. That matters to me. Why? Sungmin's voice had shifted, not broken, not defensive, but stripped of the professional warmth, down to something more direct, like two men finally speaking the language they'd both been translating from all along. It doesn't change the outcome. It changes what I think of you. Sungmin looked at him. Something passed across his face that was harder to categorize, not remorse, not quite contempt, something in between that contained elements of both and resolved into neither. Before, he said, 2 years before I joined, they approached me after the review. After Choi Sr. made sure I left that firm with nothing. They offered you a way back in. They offered me a position that would take years and would pay, eventually. He said it without self-pity, just factual, the way someone describes a business arrangement they've been inside long enough to stop feeling anything complicated about. I was 31. I had been professionally dismantled by a man whose son would eventually be placed in the compliance seat of whatever organization I was building toward. The structure was already planned. So you were recruited before you ever walked through this door, Saison said. Yes, the 6 years. Saihan looked at him. You did good work. I know. That almost makes it worse. Sungmin's jaw tightened fractionally. You want to talk about worse? You want to have a conversation about what's worse? His voice didn't rise, but something in it shifted, the controlled directness dropping toward something rawer. I spent 6 years watching you run this organization with one hand while you dismantled your own marriage with the other and called it private. I spent 6 years being trusted with things that mattered and watching you trust a woman you were lying to with things that didn't. You want to tell me what's worse? You used her, Sahian said. The flatness in his voice had a specific quality, now not anger, which would have been easier to navigate. Something colder. You used what happened to my wife to build the conditions you needed. You sat on photographs for months. You timed it. You made sure she got enough to act on. You used her grief as a mechanism. Sungmin didn't answer. Did you know she had 2 miscarriages? A pause. Yes. And you still... I didn't photograph her grief, Sungmin said. I photographed your choices. She was the most obvious person to send them to. That doesn't make her a casualty, it makes her the person with the most legitimate claim to the information. You made her a tool, Saihyun said. You handed her a weapon and pointed her at a target and told yourself it was justice. Wasn't it? The question landed in the room and sat there. Sion didn't answer immediately. He couldn't, because the honest answer was complicated in a way that wouldn't help him and wouldn't satisfy Sungmin and would only clarify, for both of them, that the moral landscape of this situation had no clean ground anywhere. Daejun, he said. The door opened. Daejun came in with Cha, and 2 men Saihin had never formally introduced to Sungmin, and Sungmin looked at them and understood precisely what they represented, and his face went through one final recalibration past calculation, past controlled professionalism, into something stripped down and functional. The face of a man deciding very quickly what his options were and how many of them he actually had. The account in Singapore, Sahian said, I need the full chain. Every name, every intermediate, every instruction you received and from whom and when. He paused. You can give me that now, or you can give it to me after a much less comfortable conversation. Sungmin looked at Cha. He looked back at Saihian. I want immunity from the organization, he said. Whatever you do with the information, I walk away. My family is untouched. Your family was never my target. I want it stated. Stated by whom? Sion said. There's no document for this conversation. Then I want your word. The room was very quiet. Saihin looked at the man across the table. 6 years of trusted work. 6 years of genuine operational competence applied to a purpose. Saihin hadn't seen. A decade of prior planning he had never looked for, because the looking would have required him to distrust something he had found comfortable to trust. Your family is untouched, he said. You have my word. Sungmin reached into his briefcase. He removed a USB drive and set it on the table. Everything, he said. 3 years of communications. Account structures, contact names, instruction chains. He looked at Saihyun, including the contact who handled the compliance side. Which is not Choi Jr. He paused. Choi Jr. is as much a planted instrument as I was. The actual compliance contact is someone you've met socially. Multiple times. Saihan looked at the drive. Who? He said. Sung Min told him. The name landed in Saihan's chest, like something physical, not a blow, more like the specific sensation of a floor, dropping an inch beneath your feet, the body registering structural wrongness before the mind has processed the information. It was a name he knew from dinners, from the margins of family events, from the kind of social proximity that feels like trust because it's maintained consistently over years and never asks for anything specific. How long? Sihin said. From the beginning, Sungmin said. Before I joined, the entire architecture was in place, before you ever shook my hand. Saihin walked out of the conference room at 4:47 and went directly to the bathroom at the end of the corridor and stood at the sink with the water running and looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment. His face looked the same as it always did. That somehow made it worse. He should look different. He felt different, not devastated, not angry in any clean way, but hollowed out in a specific location. The way a structure looks when load-bearing material has been removed, and everything above is temporarily holding through inertia rather than support. He turned off the water. He dried his hands. He went back into the corridor and called his father. Zuyun answered on the third ring, which meant he was not in a meeting, and had seen the caller ID and had decided to answer rather than return the call later, which, with Do-Yun, meant the situation had his full attention. I need you to halt the audit, Si-hyun said, silence. The audit exposes nothing we can afford to expose right now, Si-hyun said. The compliance infrastructure has been compromised. And seen. If the audit proceeds through the current compliance chain, we are presenting our complete financial architecture to people who want to use it to acquire the company's operational interests. Tell me who, Do-Yun said, Si-hyun told him. The silence on the other end of the line was the particular silence of a man in his 70s who has navigated 50 years of complicated situations, processing a new piece of information at full speed while presenting no surface reaction. How solid is the evidence? Do-Yun said. USB drive with 3 years of communications. I'll have it analyzed tonight, but the source has no reason to fabricate his personal safety, depends on the accuracy of what he's given me. The name you just said, yes. He was at your wedding, Do-Yun said. I know, another silence. Halt the audit, Do-Yun said. I'll make the call myself. I'll say the scope needs recalibration. I've been concerned the focus is too narrow. That buys us 2 weeks. A pause. What do you need after that? An external forensic accounting team. Nothing connected to any of our existing relationships. Someone from outside Seoul, ideally outside Korea. I know someone in Singapore, Do-Yun said. Not Singapore, Si-hyun said. A beat. No, you're right. Not Singapore. Another pause. I'll find someone. Give me until Friday. The name I gave you. The social contact. He needs to believe nothing has changed. I understand how this works, Do-Yun said, with the faint edge of a man who had been navigating this kind of situation since before his son was born. What about the woman? Si-hyun said nothing for a moment. The evidence she holds, Do-Yun said. If the people behind this want access to our financial documentation. I know, Si-hyun said. If they approach her attorney. I know, Si-hyun. His father's voice was careful. She is in Copenhagen with documentation that is now potentially valuable to people who are not above using other methods to obtain what they need. I understand the exposure. Do you have a way to reach her? Not directly. Then find one, Do-Yun said. Whatever the cost. Find one. The call ended. Si-hyun stood in the corridor with his phone in his hand and thought about Copenhagen. About a woman standing in front of a 19th century portrait in a museum restoration studio. About the specific way she worked slowly, methodically, removing damage without disturbing what was underneath. About the fact that she was there because she had left everything behind with perfect precision and no safety net, and she was doing exactly what she had always been capable of doing, and she was doing it without him, which was what she had correctly determined she needed. And she was in possession of evidence that people with significant resources and no visible moral constraints had built a 3-year strategy around obtaining. He called Dae-jun. I need a contact in Copenhagen, he said. Someone completely clean. No organizational connection. Someone who can make contact with a private individual without appearing threatening. He paused. A lawyer, not Korean. Someone neutral. That will take. Fast, Saihyun said. As fast as you can. He went back to his office. On the desk was a message from Celeste Monroe Han's office, the divorce settlement timeline, sent as a matter of procedural courtesy. The settlement conference was scheduled in 3 weeks. Imani would return to Seoul briefly for the final proceedings. 3 weeks. He put the message face down. He picked up the USB drive that Daejun had brought up from the conference room and turned it over in his fingers, the way he had turned over the flash drive Imani had left on his desk. A sound like, and he thought about how many devices small enough to hold in one hand were currently containing information that could destroy his family's life's work. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. International prefix. European, he answered. Mr. Baek, a woman's voice. Not Korean. Measured professional, slightly accented, in a way he couldn't immediately place. My name is not important. What is important is that I am calling on behalf of a party who has an interest in Mrs. Beck Delacroix's legal proceedings and who wish to extend an offer privately at this stage regarding the documentation in her attorney's possession. Cyan's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of offer, he said. A generous one, the woman said, structured as a consultancy arrangement with one of our associated firms. Mrs. Beck Delacroix's attorney receives a significant retainer. The documentation is transferred as part of a standard legal services consolidation. Mrs. Beck Delacroix herself receives a settlement supplement that more than doubles the figure currently under negotiation. A pause. Everyone benefits. The matter resolves quietly. We would prefer it resolved quietly. And if it doesn't resolve quietly, Sihyun said, then the matter becomes more complicated, the woman said. For everyone. The pause was deliberate. The word everyone was deliberate. The woman's voice was professional and completely unhurried, which was its own form of threat, the tone of someone who has made this kind of call many times and has learned that the most effective pressure sounds like a conversation. I need 24 hours, Saihyun said. You have 12, the woman said. We'll call again at 8 tomorrow morning. The call ended. Cyan set the phone on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up again and called a number he had not called. In 3 years, a private contact he had maintained carefully and used rarely precisely because using it rarely kept it valuable. A man named Yeo, who had connections in 3 European cities and owed Saihyun a debt that had been sitting untouched for 36 months because Saihyun had understood that the right time to collect it had not yet arrived. I need someone in Copenhagen tonight, he said. Not a threat. Not a confrontation. Someone who can make contact with a woman who has every reason not to trust anyone connected to me and deliver a message that she will understand is genuine. He paused. The message is that she is in danger, and that the danger has nothing to do with me, and that I need 20 minutes of her attention through a channel of her choosing. Tonight is difficult, Yeo said. I know. It will cost more than the original debt. I know that too, Saihyun said. Do it anyway. He ended the call. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed a deliberate, measured breath, kind he used before high-stakes meetings, when he needed his body to stop registering the situation as an emergency and start processing it as problem to be solved. His chest was tight. There was a persistent pressure behind his sternum that had been there since the phone call from the unknown woman, which his body understood as the specific danger of having someone use a civilized voice to describe an uncivilized threat. They had moved faster than he expected. The call meant they knew the audit had been halted. It meant they had eyes inside Baekjin's corporate structure beyond Choi Jr. and the social contact he had named, or it meant the halt order had leaked faster than Do-Yun intended, which was its own problem. It meant they were not willing to wait for a comfortable resolution. 12 hours. He had 12 hours to find a way to reach a woman in Copenhagen who had specifically structured her departure from his life to make him unreachable to her, using a contact he had called in a favor to deploy, with a message she had every reason not to believe, asking for 20 minutes of trust she had no reason to extend. He stood up. He went to the window. Seoul was doing what it always did, moving. lit, enormous, indifferent. The Han River caught the last of the evening light on its surface in long, flat strips. He thought about Imani standing at a different window, in a different city, in an apartment she had chosen herself, with no guards outside and no marble staircase and no staff and no one watching, which was what she had described to him. In one of the last real conversations they had before everything, as the thing she thought she missed most about living alone. Not freedom from responsibility, just the simple, unremarkable freedom of a space that was entirely her own. He had given her something that looked like safety and was actually architecture. He had surrounded her with the infrastructure of his world and called it love, and never asked whether it fit. She had answered that question herself, on a Monday morning, in the 8 hours he gave her. He turned from the window. His phone buzzed. A message from Dae-jun. The USB is clean. Communications authenticated. 3 years. Full chain confirmed. The name holds. Below it, a second message. One more thing. The external account trace. The Singapore vehicle. Its most recent transaction was 10 days ago. Transfer destination, a law firm in Copenhagen. Cyan read it twice. He read it a third time. The law firm in Copenhagen. He pulled up the settlement documents on his laptop and went to the second page, where the opposing counsel was listed alongside Celeste Monroe Han's firm as co-representation for international jurisdiction matters. The law firm listed on Dae-jun's message and the law firm listed on the settlement documents were the same. He sat very still. Celeste Monroe Han had brought in Copenhagen co-counsel for the international settlement. The Copenhagen co-counsel had received a transfer from the Singapore vehicle 10 days ago. Imani's evidence was not simply at risk of being approached through a financial offer to her attorney. Her attorney's international partner had already been reached, which meant the offer the woman on the phone had described, the consultancy arrangement, the retainer, the settlement supplement, was not a future possibility. It was already in motion. And Imani, standing in her museum in Copenhagen, believing she had left everything dangerous behind her in Seoul, was at the center of it, without knowing it, surrounded by legal infrastructure that had been quietly compromised before she ever arrived. Cyan stood up from the desk, so fast the chair rolled back and hit the credenza. He called Yeo back. "It's not just a message," he said. "She's in immediate danger. The legal structure around her has been compromised. I need your person there tonight, and I need them to get her out of whatever normal looks like before 8 tomorrow morning." "That's a different operation," Yeo said. "Name the price." A pause. "This is not about price, Baek-sion. This is about what I'm willing to ask my people to do, and on what basis. On the basis that she is a civilian who was used as a mechanism in something she knew nothing about, and the people who used her are not finished using her, and I am the reason she is exposed." He stopped. "That's the basis." Yeo was quiet for a long moment. "I have someone in Copenhagen," he said finally. "A woman. She works independently. She's done this kind of work before. Send her tonight. She'll need something to show your wife," Yeo said. "Something that proves the message is from you, without involving your name in any document." Cyan thought for exactly 3 seconds. "Tell her to say 5 words," he said. "Your wife will know they're from me." "What 5 words?" Cyan looked at the window. At the city below, at his own reflection in the darkening glass, a man who had spent years building something enormous and was now standing in it, watching the walls come down from a direction he hadn't been watching. He said the 5 words. Yeo repeated them back. "That's it?" Yeo said. "That's it," Cyan said. He ended the call. He stood at the window with his phone in his hand, and Copenhagen 9 hours ahead, in a time zone where a woman was probably finishing her evening, probably making tea in a small apartment, probably moving through a life that had finally begun to feel like hers. And he stood there and frustrating that the 5 words he had just sent across the distance between them were the only honest currency he had left. And that whether she trusted them depended entirely on whether she believed he understood what they meant. This room was not empty. The words she had left for him in the nursery. The only 5 words that belonged to both of them, in a way nothing else did anymore. Not as accusation, not as wound, but as the one thing in the entire wreckage of their marriage that had been completely, irreducibly true. He hoped she would understand. He had no way to know if she would. The city moved below him. indifferent, and enormous, and the clock on the wall read 7:43. And somewhere in Copenhagen, a woman named Yo's contact was getting ready to knock on a door that Imani Delacroix had closed very carefully behind herself when she left. And Cyan-sun stood at the window and waited for the thing he could no longer control to either hold or break. The knock came at 10:47 in the evening. Imani had been awake. She had been awake most evenings lately, not from insomnia exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when a person has spent months rebuilding their own interior architecture and finds themselves, unexpectedly, enjoying the quiet of their own thoughts. She had been sitting at the small table by the window with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, looking at photographs she had taken of the portrait's underpaint layers that afternoon, the way the original artist had sketched the woman's jawline differently before changing his mind. A small private decision visible now, only because time had made the surface transparent. She was thinking about that, about how decisions you thought were hidden always surfaced eventually. Then the knock. She didn't move immediately. Her apartment had a buzzer at the building entrance, and nobody had used it, which meant whoever was at her door had come through a door that required a building code. That narrowed it to residents, guests of residents, or someone who had gotten the code from someone who had it. She set the photographs down. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman she had never seen, 40s maybe, dark coat, short hair, standing in the corridor with her hands visible at her sides in the specific way of someone who has learned that visible hands communicate non-threat. Imani did not open the door. "Who are you?" she said through the door. "My name is Rias," the woman said. Her Korean was accented but fluent. "I was sent by someone you know. I have something to tell you, and I would prefer to tell you inside, but I understand if you need something first." "Something like what?" "A reason to open the door." A pause. "He said to give you 5 words. He said you would know they were from him." Imani stood at the door. Her hand was on the latch, but not moving. "Say them," she said. "The woman named Reese said them." This room was not empty. The words hit Imani in a place she hadn't expected. Not in the chest, not in the throat, somewhere lower and more central, in the part of the body where the real responses live, before they become articulable. She stood at the door for a moment, with her hand on the latch, and her eyes closed, and the word him rearranging itself from an abstraction into a specific person sending a specific message across a specific distance. He knew what those words meant. He knew because she had left them for him. He knew because he had stood in the nursery doorway and read them, and they had done what she intended them to do, which was not to wound him. Exactly, but to make him look at something real, without the option of looking away. That he was using them now, as a token of verification, meant he understood their weight. She opened the door. Rias came in and stood in the center of the small apartment and looked around once not nosily, but with the swift professional assessment of someone cataloging a space for situational awareness. She did not sit down until Imani indicated the chair. When she sat with her coat on, which meant she did not expect to be here long. "Your legal representation in Copenhagen," Rees said. "The co-counsel firm, your sole attorney, brought in for international jurisdiction." Imani looked at her. "Lindquist and Hoyer. They received a transfer 10 days ago from a Singapore-registered investment vehicle. The vehicle connects to a consortium with interests in Korean logistics infrastructure. Specifically, interests in acquiring the operational infrastructure currently controlled by Baekjin Holdings." Rias said it without editorializing. "The way someone presents a map here is the terrain. Navigate it yourself. The consortium has been running a 3-year operation inside Baekjin's organizational structure. They triggered the conditions that led to your divorce filing." Imani was very still. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means the photographs sent to you were not sent out of loyalty or conscience. They were sent to force a public scandal that would trigger a financial audit, remove Mr. Baek from corporate operations, and create the regulatory pressure needed to weaken the family's control of the company." Rias paused. "Your evidence, the financial documentation you hold, is what they want now. With it, they can accelerate the regulatory exposure and create the conditions for an acquisition. Your co-counsel has been positioned to facilitate the transfer. Imani looked at the photographs on her table, the underpaint layers, the jawline that had been changed before anyone could see it. Celeste, she said, my sole attorney. Does she know? No. The co-counsel was introduced through a referral network that appeared legitimate. Ms. Monroe Hahn has no knowledge of the connection. Ria set a document on the table, a single printed page, dense with account numbers and transfer dates. This is the chain. You can verify it independently. Imani picked up the document. She read it. Her eyes moved down the page with the methodical focus she used when examining a painting for damage, not skimming, not reacting, reading. She set it down. The offer, she said, the woman who called Sai Hyun. Is she going to call me? Through your co-counsel, most likely. Framed as a settlement enhancement, Rias looked at her directly. They will present it as a better outcome for you. More money, faster resolution, a reason to transfer the documentation through legal channels that appear routine. And if I refuse, Rias was quiet for a moment. The quiet was its own answer. How much time do I have? Imani said. Mr. Bake's contact gave them until 8 tomorrow morning. After that, the approach shifts. Imani looked at the window. At the Copenhagen street below, wet from earlier rain, the streetlights making long reflections on the pavement. A bicycle went past, its rider hunched against the cold. He's trying to protect me, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He's trying to warn you, Rias said. What you do with it is yours. Imani stood up. She went to the kitchen, not for anything specific, but because she needed to move. Needed 12 feet of distance between herself and the document on the table while she thought. She put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the backsplash and breathed in and out and let the information settle through her, the way she let a new solvent settle into a damaged surface waiting to see what it revealed rather than reacting to its first contact. She thought about the photographs arriving under the door, the careful timing, the way they had come in a sequence designed to build a case, rather than simply reveal one moment because a single photograph might be dismissed, but 11, spaced across weeks, created a narrative, a structure, evidence. She had thought it was someone's conscience. It had been someone's strategy. She had been handed exactly what she needed to do, exactly what she had done, by people who needed her to do it. The fact that she had been right, the affair had been real, the betrayal had been real, the financial misconduct had been real, did not change the fact that her rightness had been weaponized by people who needed it, aimed in a specific direction at a specific moment. She had been used, and Sai Hyun, who had used her in an entirely different and more personal way for years, had just sent 5 words across the distance between them to tell her so. She went back to the table. I need to call Celeste, she said. Yes, Rhys said. Tonight. And I need an independent attorney. Someone with no connection to any party in this. Someone in Seoul who handles corporate and criminal matters and doesn't owe anyone anything I don't know about. Rhys reached into her coat pocket and set a card on the table. Mr. Bake suggested, you might need this. It's a name. He says he has no relationship with this person professionally and no leverage over them. He said to tell you, that's the most he can offer in terms of clean. Imani looked at the card. She picked it up. She looked at Rias. Did he say anything else? Rias considered this for a moment with the care of someone deciding how much of a message to transmit verbatim. He said that you deserve to make every decision in this with complete information, and that he's sorry the complete information took this long to reach you. Imani set the card down. She did not say anything for a moment. Tell him I received the message, she said. Both of them. She called Celeste at 11:15, which was 18:15 in Seoul, and Celeste answered on the second ring, because Celeste answered calls at all hours when the caller ID said Imani. Imani told her everything. She told it in the order it needed to be understood, starting with Rias at the door, and moving through the Singapore vehicle, and the transfer, and the co-counsel, and the consortium, and what Rias had described as the approaching offer. She told it without excess emotion, which was harder than it sounded. There was a specific quality to learning that your own legal process had been infiltrated, that required conscious management, because the body wanted to react to it as violation, which it was, but the moment was not the time for violation. Celeste was quiet through most of it. She asked two clarifying questions at specific points about the transfer date and about the referral network that had introduced the co-counsel, and both questions were the right questions, which was why Imani had hired her. When Imani finished, Celeste said, "How solid is the documentation she brought you?" "Solid enough that I can verify it. Give me 2 hours. I'll need to assess the co-counsel relationship immediately. If they've been compromised, anything they have access to in our case file is potentially exposed." A pause. "Imani, the settlement conference is in 3 weeks. I know. If we have to rebuild the co-counsel structure from scratch." "I know," Imani said. "Do it anyway. Whatever it takes." Another pause. Then Celeste said, in a different register, not the attorney voice, something more direct, "He warned you." "Yes. That cost him something, strategically. I know that too." "What do you want to do with it?" Celeste said. "The evidence. Given what you know now about how it was set in motion." Imani looked at the document Rias had left on the table. She looked at the photographs of the underpaint layers beside it. The woman in the portrait slowly emerging beneath her hands, the original surface coming back through the damage. "The evidence is still true," she said. "What was done to me is still real. The money was still misused. The marriage is still over." She paused. "What someone else's motivation was for showing me, the truth doesn't make the truth false." "No," Celeste said, "it doesn't. But I'm not letting them use it," Imani said. "Whatever they plan to do with my documentation, that's finished. I want it restructured, held differently, in a way that makes it legally mine and operationally inaccessible to anyone I haven't personally authorized." "I can do that," Celeste said. "I'll start tonight." "And the name he sent me, the independent attorney in Seoul. Send it to me. I'll vet them by morning." Imani ended the call. She sat at the table in her small Copenhagen apartment for a long time after that. Not frozen, not dissociated thinking, which was what she did when situations required it, always had. Sighing. She had learned to think under pressure in graduate school, in the specific crucible filtration work where a wrong decision cost months and sometimes damaged what you were trying to save permanently. She thought about the consortium, about 3 years of patient architecture, about the man who had sent photographs to her door with calculated timing, using her justified grief as a precision instrument. She thought about Saision standing in Seoul with 12 hours and a phone and a debt he had cashed in to get 5 words to her door. She thought about what it meant that the most honest communication they'd had in years had been 5 words she had written on a white card in a pale green room. She thought about Celeste's question, "What do you want to do with it?" What she wanted to do was finish her work and live her life, and never again be a piece in anyone's strategy, including her own. She looked at the photograph of the portrait's underpaint. The woman's jaw, as the artist originally intended it. Stronger than the version he eventually painted, corrected away from. Only visible now because time had stripped the covering back. She picked up the independent attorney's card. She went to bed at 1 in the morning and slept, which surprised her. She had expected the night to be sleepless. Instead, her body made the decision that it had processed what it needed to process and the rest was work, and work could wait until morning. She slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of answer. The settlement conference, 3 weeks later, was held in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam. Imani arrived 8 minutes early. She wore the charcoal suit she had bought in Copenhagen 3 weeks into her fellowship, when she had understood she was not going back to Seoul for a long time, and had decided to build a wardrobe for the person she was becoming rather than the person she had been. It fit differently than anything she'd owned in Seoul, not because her body had changed, but because she had stopped choosing clothes that minimized her. She wore her mother's pearls. Celeste was already in the room with the independent attorney, a man named Han Junso, who had spent 20 years handling cases at the intersection of corporate and criminal law, and had the specific quality of someone who had seen enough of both to be impressed by neither. He had vetted cleanly. He had no relationship with any party in this proceeding and had taken the case with the particular interest of someone who recognized that it was more complicated than it appeared. Jun Seo had spent the preceding 3 weeks doing 2 things simultaneously, protecting the evidence in Imani's possession through a restructured legal framework that made it inaccessible to any outside party without her direct authorization, and building a parallel documentation of the consortium's operation, the Singapore vehicle, the co-counsel compromise, the 3-year organizational infiltration that was now in the hands of a financial crimes unit with no affiliation to any of the involved parties. The consortium's approach to Imani had stopped after the 8 a.m. deadline passed without a response. They had not approached again. Jun Seo believed they understood that the window had closed. He also believed they were recalibrating, which meant the work of the next months would involve staying ahead of whatever the recalibration produced. He had communicated this to Imani without softening it, which she had appreciated. Saihin entered the conference room with his attorney at 9:15. Imani had not seen him in 4 months. He looked the way men look when they have been running on a specific kind of sustained pressure for an extended period, not diminished, not broken, but worn in a particular place, like a material that has been stressed within its tolerance, but right at the edge of it. He had lost some weight. His face was composed in the flat, managed way she knew well, but beneath it, for just a moment when his eyes found hers across the table, something moved. He sat down, she sat down. Their attorneys sat beside each of them, and the mediator took the center position, and the proceedings began, which meant for the next 2 hours the conversation was conducted through legal instruments and carefully structured language, and the two of them communicated primarily by listening to others speak on their behalf. The settlement was substantial. It covered her personal assets, the restoration work and professional materials she had brought into the marriage, the legal expenses that had compounded across the past 4 months, and a figure representing the marital assets that had been misused. It was not everything she might have argued for under a different set of circumstances. It was everything she needed. Saihin's attorney raised no objections to any of it. When the final documents were placed in front of each of them for signature, Imani read every page. She read the way she always read, completely, without skipping, without allowing the discomfort of the moment to rush her past the details. Celeste had already reviewed it 3 times. Junseo had reviewed it twice. She still read it herself because it was her name at the bottom, and her name meant something she was no longer willing to be casual with. She signed. Saihyun signed. The mediator gathered the documents, and the formal portion of the proceeding ended, and the attorneys began the quiet procedural work of filing. And the room shifted in the specific way. Rooms shift when the official business is concluded, and what remains is the human aftermath. Celeste touched Imani's arm and excused herself to speak with Junseo in the corridor. Saihyun's attorney did the same. They were alone in the glass-walled room for the first time since the Hanam-dong mansion. Through the glass, Seoul moved in every direction, the particular density of it, the layers of it, the city that had been his world and had become her context, and was now neither, exactly. "You look well," Saihyun said. "I know," Imani said. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost that lived at the edge of something genuine and then decided not to cross over. "I need to say something," he said. She looked at him. Not permissively, not coldly, just waiting, the way she waited for a surface to show her what it needed before she touched it. "What I did to you," he said. "The marriage. The way it ended. Mine. All of it. None of the rest of it, Sungmin, the consortium, any of it changes what I chose. I want you to know I understand that." Imani looked at the table for a moment. "I know you do," she said. "That's the part that doesn't help you." He absorbed this without flinching. "I know, you used the right words," she said. "At the right moment, I want you to know it worked. I got out before they could move on me. That matters, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." She paused. "But I'm also not going to let it rewrite anything. I'm not asking it to." Saihin. She said his name the way she hadn't said it in months, not with anger, not with grief, with the plain weight of someone addressing a person they know very specifically and no longer have any need to manage their reaction to. "You loved yourself louder. That's what happened. Whatever else happened around it." He looked at her. "I know," he said again. And this time the words carried something heavier than acknowledgement, not an apology exactly, because he had learned from her that apologies required more than intention, but a recognition that moved through his voice like something that had been waiting a long time to be given weight in an actual room. The Sungmin situation, she said. Junso's filing. I know about it. My evidence is part of the consortium record now. It's not going anywhere near Baekjin's private interests. It's in a regulatory framework. That was the right decision, he said. I know, she straightened slightly. Your father's forensic team and Junseo's contacts are working from the same documentation at this point. Junsu told me this morning. I assume you know that too. Duyun mentioned it. Good. She picked up her pen from the table, an absent gesture, something to do with her hands. Sungmin. He's been removed, Saihyun said, cooperating with the investigation in exchange for the terms we discussed. His family is untouched. You kept your word to him. Yes. She looked at him. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite what she expected to feel, not admiration, not the opposite of it. Something more complicated, the specific texture of knowing a person well enough to see them clearly, including the parts that are still functional and real inside the wreckage of everything else. Choi Sr., she said, no longer reachable. He said it without elaboration, and she understood the elaboration wasn't her territory and didn't pursue it. Compliance infrastructure is being rebuilt externally. And the social contact, the one who was at our wedding. Saihan was quiet for a moment. That one is taking longer. He's careful. But the documentation from the USB connects him sufficiently that the regulatory investigators are already building a file. Imani nodded. Hayrin, she said. His posture shifted fractionally, just fractionally, but she saw it because she had spent 8 years learning his body's minute adjustments, the way she had learned the behavior of aging varnish under ultraviolet light. She had the baby, he said. A month ago, I know. Celeste told me. Imani looked at the table. A son. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She felt something move through her that she didn't try to name or suppress, just let it move through, the way you let a difficult solvent do its work without interfering. It was not grief for Hayrin's son. It was something older and more specific, connected to 2 pale walls she had chosen, and a room she had needed to close. I hope he's healthy, she said, and meant it. Saihyun looked at her. He is, he said. Thank you. The gratitude was for the meaning of it, that she had said it and meant it, that she had not pretended indifference, that she had not made the child carry the weight of what the child had nothing to do with. He understood the size of that. She could see that he understood it. Are you with her? Imani said, Hayrin. A pause. We're working out what that looks like. For the child. He stopped. It's not what either of us expected. No, Imani said. I imagine it's not. She stood. He stood. They faced each other across the table in the glass-walled room, with Seoul visible in every direction around them, and Imani felt the specific quality of this moment, not closure exactly. Because closure was a cleaner concept than what real endings actually felt like. A sound green wood splitting. What she felt was more like the moment in a restoration, when you've done everything that can be done, and you step back and look at the result and understand that it is not the original, will never be the original. Carries the record of everything it survived, and is still worth preserving. I missed you, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. I know what you mean by that. Do you miss me? She considered this honestly, the way she considered difficult questions without reaching for the comfortable answer. I miss who I thought you were, she said, and I'm starting to understand that what I'm really missing is the version of myself who believed in that. She deserved better care than either of us gave her. She picked up her bag. I gave her better care when I left than I did in 8 years of staying. He walked around the table. He stopped at a distance that was respectful and exact and said, Where do you go from here? Back to Copenhagen, she said. The portrait isn't finished. He nodded once. Imani. Her name in his voice had a sound it hadn't had before, or had very early, before the weight of everything came down on top of it and compressed it into something more managed. I'm glad you're safe. I know you are, she said. I'm glad I am too. She walked to the door. She stopped. Not because she doubted the direction, not because she doubted the There was one more thing that needed to be said in this room before Schlichmin, before she left it. The nursery, she said, without turning around. Saihan waited. Have the walls repainted, she said. Whatever color she wants. Let it be hers. A pause, it can be both things. A room I chose and a room she makes into something else. Things can be both. She heard him breathe. Yes, he said. She walked out. The corridor was long, and the elevator at the far end opened when she pressed the button, and Celeste fell into step beside her without speaking, because Celeste had known her long enough to understand when speaking was not the first requirement. In the elevator, going down, Celeste finally said, "How are you?" "Accurate," Imani said. Celeste looked at her. "I know exactly where I am," Imani said. That's new. She flew back to Copenhagen that evening. The flight was 4 hours, and she spent most of it looking out the window at the dark over northern Europe and thinking about the portrait. The 19th century woman who had been painted over, darkened, obscured, preserved incorrectly for generations until someone patient enough to look for the original had sat down with the right tools and begun. She thought about the artist's original sketch, the stronger jawline, the one he had changed before anyone could see it. She thought about what it meant that the change had been preserved anyway, not in the version the world had seen, but in the paint itself, in the layers beneath, waiting for someone with enough patience to find it. She landed at 4 in the morning local time and took a taxi to her apartment and went to sleep without unpacking. In the morning she went to work. The portrait took another 6 weeks. She finished it on a Thursday afternoon in late spring, when the light coming through the museum's north-facing windows was the particular quality she has learned to value, not dramatic, not romantic, just accurate. The light that shows you exactly what is there, without adding anything. She stepped back. The woman in the portrait looked back at her. 19th century, unknown name. Commissioned by a family whose descendants had donated the painting to the museum without knowing who the woman was. She had been listed only as subject, female, circa 1847 in the institutional records. She was not a beautiful painting in the sense of being easy to look at. The original artist had caught something in the woman's face that was not entirely comfortable, a quality of attention that looked like it could be directed at you and find you insufficient, and that this finding would be accurate. The woman had clearly lived inside that quality of attention all her life. You could see it in the way the paint sat, in the choices the artist had made about what to include and what to soften, and the choices he had ultimately not been able to make because the truth of the face had been stronger than his ability to redirect it. Imani stood in front of it for a long time. Then she wrote her report. Months passed. Copenhagen in summer was different from Copenhagen in winter in ways Imani had not anticipated: louder, lighter, populated with a version of the city that came out specifically for the warmth and then retreated again when the cold returned, like a tide. She had been through one full cycle of it now. She understood the rhythm. Her studio opened in the fall. It was small, a rented ground floor space on a quiet street, with north-facing windows she had specifically requested and work tables she had built herself with materials from a shop 2 streets over where the owner spoke no English, and she spoke Danish, and they had communicated entirely through pointing and the occasional precise gesture, which had been one of the more satisfying conversations she'd had in recent memory. The first client was a family from Odense who had a pair of daguerreotypes damaged in a flood, the only photographs of their great-grandparents, water-stained and foxed and handled too many times by too many hands over too many years. She spent 2 weeks on them. When she returned them, the grandmother of the family held them for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at Imani with an expression that Imani had seen before, in the faces of people who have been given back something they had accepted as gone. They look like themselves again, the woman said. They always looked like themselves, Imani said. There was just damage in the way. Back in Seoul, the consortium investigation moved slowly, and then quickly, the way complex regulatory matters do, months of accumulation, followed by a period of sudden acceleration when enough documentation reached enough people with authority to act. The Singapore vehicle was dissolved under regulatory order. 2 board members of the connected holding company were subject to formal investigation in their respective jurisdictions. The man who had attended Saihyun's wedding was named in a filing that became briefly a subject of financial press coverage. Imani read the article on her phone on a Tuesday morning before she opened the studio and felt something that was not satisfaction exactly, more like the specific quiet of a system returning to equilibrium after a prolonged imbalance. Sung Min disappeared from public record. Choi Jr. resigned from Baekjin Holdings and was not publicly heard from again. Do Yun oversaw the restructuring of the company's compliance infrastructure with the thoroughness of a man who has discovered that the mechanism he trusted contained deliberate failures and intends never to be in that position again. Tsai Hyun returned to a reduced corporate role, not restored to what he had been, but present, functioning, working within the constraints that the audit and the restructuring had established. Jun Seo sent Imani quarterly updates for the first year, which she read and filed, and then less frequently as the matters resolved, and then a final summary at the end of 18 months that indicated all outstanding legal proceedings were concluded, and her documentation had served its purpose in the regulatory process and been properly archived. She sent him a bottle of wine and a short note. He sent back a photograph of the bottle and a message. "I hope Copenhagen treats you as well as you deserve." She put the message on the small board above her work table, where she kept things that were small and true. Haerin and Saihyun did not marry. They had tried, in the months after the settlement, to build something that worked for the child, for the arrangement, for the version of their relationship that existed once the drama of its origin had settled into ordinary days. What they discovered in ordinary days was that they had been passionate in pursuit of something and indifferent to each other, once the pursuit was over, which was perhaps the truest thing that could be said about how they had come together in the first place. They separated with less ceremony than Sayan's marriage to Imani, had dissolved no photographs on walls, no flash drives, no 5 words left in a pale green room. Just 2 people acknowledging, in a series of careful, practical conversations, that the child they shared was a complete reason to remain in each other's lives, and not a sufficient reason to be in each other's company. Haerin moved to Busan. The child stayed in Seoul during the school terms and traveled between them. Myungja, who had expected to preside over the Baek family's next generation with the authority she had spent decades accumulating, found instead that she presided over a restructured and reduced version of the family that required less of the specific skills she had spent those decades developing. She withdrew from certain social circles, not forcibly, but by the natural attrition of having been seen by the people in those circles to have helped build a situation whose collapse had been public and unmistakable. She did not speak of Imani in family conversations. But once, at a quiet dinner with Do Yoon in the second year after, she said, "The watercolors. I wonder where she hung them." Do Yoon looked at her. "In her studio, I would imagine," he said. "Yes," Myungja said. "I would imagine so too." They did not speak of it further. But the subject had been named, which was its own form of reckoning, small and private and real. One rainy Sunday morning in Copenhagen, nearly 3 years after she had left Seoul, Imani sat at the table by the window with tea she was actually drinking and realized she had gone an entire week without thinking about any of it. Not Saihyun, not the mansion, not the nursery, not the photographs on the walls. Not the 5 words sent across the distance, not the conference room in Gangnam, or the elevator closing, or the portrait of the unknown woman emerging beneath her hands. An entire week in which her mind had been occupied by other things: the new commission, a conversation with Priya, a book she'd been reading, a sound like particular quality of light on the canal on Wednesday evening when she had walked home a different way and stopped on a bridge and stood there for 10 minutes just watching the water. An entire week of being a person whose life was about things that were hers. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood and put her cup in the sink and put on her coat and went to the studio. On one wall hung a single photograph she had printed in the weeks after she arrived in Copenhagen. It showed the Hanam-dong mansion from the street, the gate closing behind her car on the morning she left. She had taken it through the rear window of the driver's car, one hand holding the phone, the other holding the watercolor wrapping so it wouldn't slide. The mansion was large and still and formal behind its gate. The way it had always been beautiful in the way of things built to communicate power rather than welcome. She kept the photograph because it reminded her of something she needed to remember, that leaving had been the bravest thing she had ever done, and that she had done it with 2 suitcases and her mother's pearls and 2 paintings that had cost her something real to make, and that none of what came after, not the consortium, not the settlement, not the 5 words in the corridor, not the glass-walled room in Gangnam, had been as hard as the decision she had made on that Monday morning before the city woke up. When people in the studio asked about it, she told them it was a house she used to live in. When they asked why she kept it, she told them what was true. Because that was the first place I ever left, without leaving myself behind. She turned from the photograph. On the work table, under the north-facing light that showed everything accurately without adding anything, a new commission waited, a family portrait from the 1920s, badly fought. The subjects' faces obscured beneath a century of improper storage and good intentions gone wrong. She put on her apron. She sat down. She picked up the first tool. Outside the window, Copenhagen moved through its morning in the ordinary, indifferent, entirely sufficient way of a city that had been there before her and would be there after, and had no particular feeling about her presence except to provide it with context and light. She began. The damage was real. The damage was not the end of the story. And what remained, once the work was done, would belong entirely to itself, not to what had harmed it, not to what had tried to use it, not to the years of obscuring accumulation, but to its own original surface, finally visible, finally free to be looked at clearly. She worked until noon without stopping. Then she made tea. Then she went back to work.